World Vision works in 100 countries, and in many of them, certainly in the regions that I've visited, up to 50 or 60% of the landmass might be degraded. And so this natural resource that we expect to make our living off, grow our food off, is either hard pan or deeply gullied or unusable in some way. And to me, that's a very, very serious issue. When you add to that the prospect of climate change, where temperatures are going to be rising, weather patterns are going to be more variable, it's going to be harder and harder to grow crops on the same area of land. And then add to that again, rising populations. So I find it very scary. And last year, an agricultural advisor, international agricultural advisor, Roland Bunch, made very dire predictions for areas of Africa, and he called it the perfect storm, where you've got growing populations, you've got the cessation of the practice of fallowing, because there's simply too many people, they can't rotate their land anymore, and people can't afford artificial fertilizers at the same time that they no longer have livestock to produce manure. And he gives many of the lowland regions of Africa just 10 to 15 years before there's a mighty famine as a consequence of that.
Remind people who perhaps don't know what the lowlands are, and I certainly don't, where are we talking about in terms of lowlands? Because obviously in East Africa and the Sahel, we've read a lot about how famines have hit some regions, Niger and Somalia and Kenya and other countries. So what do we mean by the lowlands?
I guess I was thinking in terms of elevation, which is pretty much most of Africa.
Right.
Yeah. So the lower elevations tend to have higher temperatures and more erratic rainfall.
And why is this the case? Because I mean, why are we facing that kind of critical situation? What are people not doing to their farmlands? What are industries doing to lands and destroying them in such a sort of seemingly kind of savage way, if it's just 10 to 15 years away?
I think our approach to land use is more akin to mining than to land stewardship. And just through some very, very simple processes such as conservation agriculture, where you're leaving the crop residue, the straw on the land, to have a natural cover that's mulching it, reducing the evaporation, eventually rotting down to become organic matter, leaving the indigenous species, obviously not as dense as a forest, but a good scattering of them on the farmland, because trees will reduce wind speed, they'll reduce the impact of heavy rainfall, they'll be dropping leaf litter onto the soil, bringing nutrients from deep in the soil profile. All these very, very simple steps have been side-passed, and we're paying the consequences of it now. I forget the exact figures, but if you have a 2 to 3% increase in soil organic matter, the ability of the soil to retain moisture increases by, it's something like 250,000 litres per hectare. Very, very significant. And yet, I think in non-government organisations, the media, governments, we're very good at blaming drought for crop failure, whereas from my experience, we should be blaming land degradation, abuse of land, because we've turned the situation around where the land can no longer buffer the worst fluctuations in the weather. It can no longer perform as it's meant to perform, and so it's not storing moisture. More is evaporating, more is being shed in a storm, and the root cause isn't drought at all. It's the fact that the land has been altered, can no longer function as it should.
Now, in Africa, one of the countries that has been almost worst affected to some degrees by drought and famine is Niger. It's a country you're very familiar with. Tell us a bit about the work you've been doing there, and what sort of what you've learned from your time there.
My family and I lived in Niger for 17 years, and we started off trying to address desertification in a very conventional way. By raising trees in a nursery and planting them out. Unfortunately, under those harsh conditions, it was pretty much a total failure. Very, very discouraging. what we discovered, quite by accident, but for me personally it was an answer to prayer, because I was at the point of being ready to go home. There's a vast underground forest across millions of hectares, not only in Niger, but across the Sahel and across many, many other regions of Africa. And what I mean by the underground forest is the original trees were cut down, but the roots are still intact, the stumps are still there, and for most tree species, not all, your pines won't do this, some others won't do this, but for most tree species, they do not die when you cut them down. And they have this regenerative capacity to send up fresh shoots. And all that's required is not an expensive and complex tree planting program. All that's required is a change in the way people manage the land and this regrowth. And when I made this discovery, which is actually a rediscovery because the technical term for this is coppicing, and even in the UK and Europe it goes back some 3,000 years, so it's not a new thing. But when I stumbled on that, to me the game changed. I was no longer fighting the Sahara Desert. It was no longer a technical or financial issue of how we're going to do this. It was a battle for the hearts and minds of people. Why is it? What's in your beliefs, your actions, your practices that makes you want to cut down every tree, and when they try to regrow, that makes you slash them again and prevent them from coming up? And what steps would it take to convince you to select the trees that are valuable and can restore the soil and the environment and manage them in a sustainable way to benefit from them? And that process of working with people, bringing people to an understanding that trees are our friends and are actually essential if we're going to survive and be able to produce crops, that process took between 5 and 10 years in the district that I lived in. And then over a 20-year period, the method spread to more than 5 million hectares across Niger.
So, roll me back a bit. So did you find these trees under the sand, or did you just find them? And how do you regenerate trees that are just sort of sitting there with their roots in the ground? I mean, is there a process you can explain?
Yes. Well, the trees were resprouting constantly, but most of the southern third of Niger is agricultural land.
Right.
And what happens is a normal part of land preparation is that the people slash this regrowth. So the regeneration is happening, but it's checked every year. And then in the dry season, there's constant grazing from the goats and pressure, cutting that regrowth for firewood. And so the trees never had a chance to come back. Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. So you found these trees, yeah. And if local communities look after them, and if they don't immediately slash them, as you say, will they then grow back? I mean, did you see a forest re-emerge in the space of, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years?
Yes, they'll grow back very, very rapidly. And so initially we were able to convince just 10 farmers, 10 brave or perhaps foolish farmers, to do this on a portion of their land, remembering that this is a country where even in a non-famine year, people rarely have enough to eat throughout the year. And so they were fearful because the main belief about trees and crops is they don't go together. The trees will compete with your crop yield and you'll have less food to eat. So they were fearful. And they're also fearful for social reasons. If you do anything different in a traditional society, you're going to be laughed at and ridiculed and ostracized. And that's exactly what happened. But we had their attention the very next year. We started that in 1983. And I'm not sure that those 10 guys would have persevered under the pressure that they're experiencing. And in the end, others were coming and cutting their trees anyway. But in 1984, it was a very serious famine year. We had a food for work program, and the government said, if you're going to give grain, people who are able-bodied have to work for it. And this regulation played into our hands. And so we had a captive audience of a whole district for almost perhaps 8 months. And they were pruning these trees for that period. The next September, the rains returned. People said, finished with that nuisance Tony, and 2/3 of the trees, there are about 500,000 trees that were protected that way, 2/3 of them got cut out. But we had a critical mass, 1/3 was still there. The farmers said, he's not completely crazy, there's something in this. The wind speed was a little bit less, so our crops weren't so buffeted. We had a little bit of extra firewood from the pruning. There's now a little bit more fodder because many of these species have edible leaves or edible seed pods. And it seems to us the soil's becoming more fertile because the animals are camping in the shade and the organic matter's enriching the soil. Within just 1 year, those trees were probably 2 meters tall. Within 2 years, they're 3 to 4 meters tall. So very, very significant growth at no cost to the farmer, and in fact not additional work, less work, because they're no longer slashing the whole tree. And then all the benefits. Some of these trees had wild fruits, nuts, edible leaves. Certainly many had fodder, the fuel wood, and then the protection, the environmental services that they gave. So they started to build on this and expand, and when they were benefiting they would share with their neighbours, and this organic process kicked into place, and over 20 years it just spread to 50% of the farmland in Niger.
What's the situation there in the region you worked in like now? Because we obviously still hear about famines and issues in Niger, so give us a sense about the areas you've worked in. Have they maintained those practices?
Very much so, and some of the best farmers are leaving even up to 150 trees per hectare and still growing a crop. In fact, there's been a paradigm shift because the trees are no longer seen as weeds. They're a cash crop in their own right. It's a very significant change. And so there's no longer this concept, the tree's competing with my grain crop. The tree itself is a convertible item that if you have the money you can then buy the grain. And in addition, grain yields actually doubled with the protection of the trees. Now, despite the fact that across those 5 million hectares, an additional 500,000 tonnes of grain have been grown every year because of the environmental impact, people are still hungry. We're still having famines, and I think the factor is nothing's been done about population growth. And this is the frightening thing. In 1960, there were 4 million people. I arrived in Niger in 1980. There were about 8 million people, and today I believe there are around 16 million. There are ecological limits to what the land can carry, and that issue must be addressed if we're going to come out on top.
Okay. We'll leave the population debate for someone else, because that's a controversial one, and plenty of people have very vociferous views. One person I wanted to ask you about was a person that has been at this conference this week. Few people could have missed him. A Burkina Faso farmer called Yakuba. I hope I've pronounced his name right. A man who there's a film being made about him. It's the man who stopped the desert. Tell us, if you can, and tell people watching this what makes him in particular so special in his techniques.
He's an amazing man, and he's worked miracles on his farm, and had a big enough heart to share those methods with his neighbours and even beyond the region, some of whom were his enemies at the start, because what he did was so countercultural that people thought they were doing the right thing by their tradition, by their history, to try to prevent him, to the point at one stage of even burning his property. What's special about it is that land became totally unproductive because of the unsustainable farming methods people were using. Organic matter was lost, trees were removed, and that lateritic soil under those semi-arid conditions rapidly turns to stone. It forms a very hard concrete-like crust on the surface, and then when the rains come, it's shed. You get a flood downstream because that rainfall is no longer soaking into the ground. And people were probably getting, in the years that they did get a crop, they were probably only getting around 300 kilograms per hectare. That's next to nothing. An average family would need at least a tonne. And particularly in the early 80s, the same drought period that we confronted in Niger, 1984, many people simply left the region. The beauty of what Yacouba did was that he persevered despite the extreme challenge. You can imagine digging holes in the soil, 40-degree temperatures, rock-hard soil, and physical, social opposition to what he was doing. And he dug these holes in his farmland. It's technically called a zai hole, or that's the traditional name for it, which really, in English terms, is just a compost pit. So it's a hole in the ground, put some organic matter in their compost, and then when the rains come, it means that instead of running off, the water will soak in, and when you plant your seeds there, there's nutrient-rich soil to grow in. And he very likely is getting between a tonne and 1,500 kilograms of grain per hectare on land that was barely producing 300. So it's a tremendous change without requiring support from external governments or projects, without technical expertise, which usually isn't available in remote rural areas, and it's something that's freely available and doable by the very poorest farmers. So that's the genius of Yacouba. And in addition, as a consequence of digging those holes, in a lot of the manure that he would have carted and placed there, very likely there were tree seeds, because the goats, the cattle eat the seeds of trees. They pass through the animal, come out in the dung, and they're ready to germinate. And so what had been barren land is now an agroforest. It's a mixed farmland forest land. And in effect, he has stopped the desert. He's pushed it back, and he's made unproductive land highly productive and brought back a lot of biodiversity that had